So excited. Starting off nice and I'm not yelling this time, just like in the mic. Um, Hopefully you can hear us and see us. We've got Unit 7 coming at you tonight. Really stoked about that. My name is Amanda. I am the founder and CEO of Fiveable and former AP Human Geography teacher. So tonight I am Misty. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi guys, I'm Kusa. I'll be guiding you guys through Unit 7, which is mostly about econ, which was probably my favorite unit when I took this course. So I'm really excited to share all of this with you guys.
Awesome. All right, I'm going to share my screen and then talk through some just like top of the hour stuff. What am I doing? All right. So I'll talk about that in a second. So tonight we're going to be talking about Unit 7 and then doing a bunch of FRQ practice. So we'll have myself and Cosette talking through Unit 7, and then Stephen will be here with Jessica and Avery to talk through a lot of FRQ practice. So that'll be a fun second half. And then tomorrow night is our grand finale. So tomorrow night's your night before the test. So we are going to be doing kind of just like running back through everything, going through each unit again, just highlighting the really top things, and then using a lot of your questions to help guide what we need to do next. Okay, so we've told you this every night, but how to make the most of a cram finale. Make sure you take notes. It's been really awesome to see how y'all are kind of crowdsourcing your notes, sharing these Google Docs, or you can write things up and just like really help yourself keep track of what you need to know. Just think of the notes as a reminder and just really keep in mind that the review packet is not going to follow the slides. So we apologize for that, but the review packet is still useful, just not while you're watching. As you all know, you can click the button below for the Cram Hub. You can get all the slides, that review packet, replays, everything. I just linked the slide deck. For the group chat, please use it for sharing tips, tricks, and participate when we ask questions. Just keep it, keep it cool, keep it human geography, AP related. And as we've mentioned before, we are on stage working to teach you, so be kind. And then the Q&A tab, we have lots of hosts also answering questions. So if you have any questions about what we're talking about or anything else, click the Q&A tab. Watch out for the comment sections of those and you'll be able to see our answers there. All right, last thing here, community agreements. So we talked about this a little bit, but please be supportive of each other. We're here to lift each other up. You are going to feel confident because everybody around you is helping you feel confident. So we're really going to support each other here. Be patient. We've been talking through a lot of stuff for the last 3 nights. If you haven't yet watched those replays, I'd suggest that you can go back and check those out. And tomorrow night we'll do a lot of Q&A. And then be kind. We're all real people. We're just, loving AP Human Geo, trying to help you all out. And then last but not least, I've seen some submissions already. So shout out to all you trying to get that bag. But we're tossing out $100 to several different students each week. So it's only Tuesday. You can still submit a post. So what you need to do is just post on TikTok or Instagram, use these hashtags, Fiveable Crams, tag us, make sure to follow us. And the idea is to just post something about your cram finale experience, your cram experience. Make us laugh, get some views. We're going to pick the best ones. All right. I think we've covered all the things we need to. The top of the hour. We are diving in here to Unit 7. To kick it off, we're first going to give you, as we always do, a brief little history lesson, just so that you kind of have a sense of how we even got here. So I'm going to kick it over to Cosette to explain industrialization.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Amanda. And I also just wanted to give my own words of wisdom for this unit before I dive in and teach. Unit 7 isn't the easiest because there's a lot of different concepts that they expect you to know and just memorize. And sometimes they don't really interact or merge with each other the best. So I'd really take this time to write down anything you don't know and spend some time reviewing that after this before the test if you're still confused about it, because it can be overwhelming, but we're going to try and break it down for you. So let's get into it. So we're going to start off by just going into kind of the history and the context of industrialization itself. So I'm going to first define it for you guys in case you aren't sure what it is. So it's basically going to be the process in which societies across the globe have transformed from going more agrarian based, which is like farming economies, to a more industrialized one. And this encompasses having an advancement in technology, but also within manufacturing. So a lot of times when we look at industrialization throughout history, we can identify 4 different stages. And during each stage, we've kind of seen this significant technological advancement and a change in nature in production. So the first stage was stage 1. And this began around in the 1750s. And basically, this is when there was the invention of the steam engine. That's something that's very important for this stage of industrialization, steam power. And so this led to the development of lots of different factories, which thus led to mass production and a big shift from handmade goods to machine-made goods. This made it so production was a lot simpler and it was more efficient, and thus they were able to grow their economies and thus industrialize. Then we get into the second stage of industrialization, also often referred to as the Second Industrial Revolution. This began in around 1870s and this really encompassed the usage of electricity. This was when electricity became more common, as well as the development of the assembly line within manufacturing. This stage saw a great increase in productivity and efficiency within manufacturing and helped expand industries such as steel and oil. Following this, we go into the third stage of industrialization, which began around the 1970s. This stage is also sometimes referred to as the digital revolution. And this is where we saw industries arise that really were going into the technology field, such as electronics, automation, and computers. We can see a lot of shifts in information for technology and also within telecommunications, which help the economies grow and thus cities industrialize. And finally, we go into our fourth and most current stage of industrialization, which began in around the 2010s. And this is going to be really characterized by a lot of the technological innovations that we've seen, such as what we're using now, the internet, the cloud spaces, artificial intelligence, and networks. Things such as 3D printing has arrived. And this stage is also all known as Industry 4.0 once you get into higher levels of economics, and is ultimately transforming the way we produce goods and services for our economies. Okay, and I think that's a good overview of these 4 stages of industrialization.
Yeah, that was really good. Don't get too bogged down in the details of these things. Just remember that, like, there are these like moments where things change, and it really does affect, like, think back to culture and agriculture and how this is in every single unit essentially.
Okay, now we're going to go into some of my favorite things, which are mercantilism, imperialism, and colonialism. Let's start off with mercantilism, which was basically an economic policy that was created within the 16th to 18th century in Europe. So mercantilism is ultimately based on the belief that a nation's wealth and power in society are measured by the stocks and just the worth of precious metals that this nation has, such as gold and silver. And so, in order to increase the stock of these precious metals, a lot of these countries back in the day focused on exporting more of them than they imported and established colonies to provide them this raw material in order to grow. And then this brings us to imperialism, which is the policy that ultimately is of extending power and influence through colonization. So the usage of imperialism is basically they usually use military force or other means in order to kind of take over another nation and just ultimately steal their powers and resources from them and take them in. So during the 19th and 20th century, a lot of European countries utilized imperialism to establish colonies in Africa, Asia, and the Americas, and they often exploited the resources and the people of these regions for their own benefits. Which brings us to colonialism, which is the practice of one country establishing political and economic control over another country or a territory. Now, this often gets closely aligned with imperialism because they are a little bit similar, but there's a slight difference. Because oftentimes, with the establishment of colonies, there's going to be this indirect control through treaties and alliances, and there's a lot less opposing on another country and taking from them. But it also does have some of those negative effects we've seen of globalization. But ultimately, we can see that a lot of examples of colonialism are how there's a lot of European countries that engaged in colonialism during what is called the Age of Exploration, which ultimately began, I think, in the 15th century and is kind of continued, I think, to the 20th century, if I believe. But those dates could be wrong. But ultimately, these two topics, these three are actually somewhat similar, but I would just remember mercantilism is a lot on like metals, precious metals, and stock values. Imperialism and colonialism are somewhat similar. However, imperialism is more of taking and really one country dominating another, while colonialism is the establishment of these colonies. While it still can be intrusive, it's not as intrusive as imperialism.
Perfect. One of the isms that we didn't include on here is capitalism, which is a big part of industrialization. And it's, you sort of have like mercantilism that then kind of transitions into capitalism, and imperialism and colonialism are really effects of that. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But first, a map. We've got lots of maps tonight. So what we wanted to show you was sort of just, we talked about this the other night, or in Unit 2, actually, the developed countries versus the least developed countries. And this map just really, like, this is the whole world. And so when you think about industrialization, a lot of times it's kind of connected, because it's essentially, when we talk about developed, we talk about, at first it was like, is this country industrialized? Did they industrialize at the same time as the others? Because then you sort of have like a 200-year head start, essentially. So if you look at this map, we can see on the dark green, you have the developed countries. So that would include the US, Canada, Western Europe, Saudi Arabia, Japan, South Korea, and then Australia and Chile. There's some other smaller ones in here as well. And then you've got transitioning countries, which are the light green, all the way to emerging countries, transitioning, another like level of transitioning. So sort of like which stage are they at, all the way down to the red, which is the least developed countries. And remember, we talked about the Green Revolution last night being, not supporting Africa as much. And so you can kind of see how all these things are really converging, right? Like the fact that most of Africa was colonized, the fact that you have things like the Green Revolution that are not benefiting Africa, exploitation still happening today, this really harms that entire region, right? So now you have countries that just have not had the time or the investment to develop because they're constantly exploited. So that's a lot of what we'll talk about tonight. Anything else you want to add on this map?
I think I saw a question that was shown on screen for a little bit that asked for an example of imperialism that isn't necessarily colonialism. And I think one of the main examples that I went over when I was an AP Human is what happened a lot during the Cold War in the United States and the Soviet Union. And this was a kind of economic focused imperialism. So it wasn't like whole imperialism, which is like can be a lot more, but this was basically economic, where the US and like members of the Soviet Union would in many developing countries, they provided aid and investment in exchange for this political influence and access to the resources, the natural resources that these countries had. So basically, they were able to give money, which these countries had a lot more of, and take the resources from the other ones. So this is purely economic, as it wasn't a true enrichment of the power, but it was still classified as economic imperialism because it had a lot of negative effects for these lesser countries that the US was going and stealing resources from.
Exactly. Yeah, a lot of the shifts, like when you think about neo-colonialism, it's like, you know, several hundred years ago, colonialism, you have literally Great Britain or the Portuguese or Spain just like owning these other spaces in like politically, economically, culturally. It's kind of like all inclusive versus more in the more modern era in the last 100 years or so, what you have is more of the economic ties where they have to rely on each other, and also like cultural imperialism too, where we sort of force, our way of life, the like Western ideals, the clothes, the food, the entertainment, like these are all forms of it too. You use these things to gain power over other countries. All right. So we talked about consequences as being positive and negative. So we're going to talk about both of them here with industrialization. So first, this top row, we have more positive consequences of industrialization. One thing to note is that all of these things happened after every single industrial revolution, but it's just like more, right? Because each industrial revolution that we talked about is like even more technology, so it's gonna really just like heighten the effects of it. All right, you can talk about the positives.
Okay, awesome. Let's go into the positives. So, one of the main ones that's exciting is that there's more food. There's an increased supply of food, decreased cost of food. But a note of this is there was some unequal distribution of the food to people in the different parts of the world. However, it was a net positive because there was increased agricultural productivity just because of all of our technological advancements. And this allowed for the growth of cities and just everyone to really go together and have this more food. The next is that there was more people. As things started to become more comfortable, as technology was increasing, there was a population boom. And this makes perfect sense because, again, as stated, if there's more food, there's going to be more people, there's more resources for people to share, and those people are more comfortable starting their own family unit. And since there's more people, there's obviously going to be more cities. People are starting to move together and to create these hubs, these centers of productions. And this is where we really start to see a lot of urbanization happening. As people are coming all from different areas, maybe they lived in smaller towns, they start to move together, bring all of their knowledge and resources and skills, and we're able to see that growth in cities. And because we see this growth in cities, we lead to another positive, which is the specialization of jobs. Because there's a lot of people working together, there's not as many people needed to be farmers, to produce food, to do these basic necessities. So we see these new opportunities and breakthroughs within the workforce, allowing people to become more specialized in different parts of either their passions within the arts or within the medical field or within public safety, as we see a lot of these different industries start to arise within the status quo. But there's also some negatives that we'll talk about.
Many.
With positives, there's always negatives in AP Human Geography. That's something I like to remember. And some of the negatives are imperialism. We talked about this before. These countries with more economic power, who may have more people, who may just be a little more developed than other countries, need more raw materials because this is something you can't just work for. So instead, they choose to go to these lesser developed countries and ultimately take advantage of them and take their raw materials. And also, it just kind of leads to new markets where people need more materials. So, again, this constant need of these natural resources. So, these more powerful, more developed countries are going to take them from these lesser powerful countries. The next is classism, and we can see a lot of this within the US itself, especially with capitalism, because we can see the divide between those who are more wealthy within the state and those who are less wealthy get bigger and bigger. Oftentimes, people in power are on the more wealthy spectrum, and so they instead choose to focus on themselves and their sphere instead of spreading the wealth, where we see these class ranks and divides go stronger throughout history as we've industrialized. Following this, we've seen climate change. As we continue to manufacture and industrialize, a lot of times this comes at a cost for environment. There's going to be pollution, increased use of carbon from these manufacturing plants, and much more that humans have attacked and caused to our Earth, which has led to climate change. And finally, we can go into workers' rights. When we think of industrialization, we think of factories and all of these big booms in production. However, in order for these people who own the factories to be the most economically profitable, they oftentimes, the people on the lower rank of the working chain, have bad conditions, long hours, and low pay, which is not fun to work with at all, but it has been a consequence.
Another thing to note is like, even like we were talking about, like even though like these happen every single time, and like one thing that I didn't put on here is the like the turnover of jobs. Every time you get this shift in technology, this like shifting industrialization moment, um, there are people who will lose their jobs because now that thing that they did, that they specialized in, has been essentially automated. And that kind of happens every single time. So like this is a very like common conversation right now because we could be on the precipice of a massive like shift like that because of AI. You can even think about like with worker rights, the writers strike that's like happening right now. You have writers for TV shows and movies going on strike because streaming has completely changed the like working environment, right? It's like changed the production environment, the, like how much content is needed, but the rights of workers don't change along with it unless the workers push for it. So there are like examples of this every step along the way. And you can really like see so much of what happens today. Like we are living in this kind of moment right now. So it felt much the same in the 1750s, just, different examples. All right. Jumping into economies, we got 4 types of economies.
Okay, perfect, guys. These are going to be your main 4 types of economies that you cover in AP Human Geo. So basically, the first one that you should know is going to be a traditional economy, which the thing I really want you to remember about a traditional economy is that it's based on these 3 things: customs, traditions, and beliefs. These types of economies are often found in more rural societies, those that are a little more enclosed from others, not in your urban hubs. They rely on these barter systems, which are basically like trading goods. Like, I'll trade you this wheat for maybe like this water supply. That's a silly example, but just kind of like trading rather than relying on like the money we have now. And resource is also reliant on resource allocation because that's going to be determined on the community's shared value. We don't see what's happening in capitalism there in these societies because often they work closely together, they really rely on each other, and money doesn't really exist. They more rely on the goods and different services that people provide. The next type of economy is going to be something that is more familiar in this world, which is going to be the market economy. And for this, you guys should remember supply and demand. But this is going to have some minimal government intervention, which is what's going to differ it from other types of economies. What we see is this whole economy is going to be based on the consumer and what they want, which is going to be demand, and how much of each item that we have, which is supply. So prices are going to be set by the demand and how much we have supply, which is basically the market. And this ultimately promotes competition and innovation because people want people to buy their goods. So if there's too much of a good and not enough demand, someone has to make their goods stand out so people will buy it. On the contrary, if there's not enough of a good and a lot of people want it, this price is going to rise. For example, diamonds, those are super expensive because there's not a lot of them, but the demand for them is really high, so that price can increase. Or let's go to like fast food. There's so many different fast food chains. They're all competing, and a lot of people want fast food, which is why the prices are set lower, so there's actually an industry for them.
Great example.
No worries. Our next type is going to be the command economy. And so this differentiates from the market economy because we really see governments coming into play. When you think of a command economy, think of like command. Who's in command? The government. The government is going to be controlling and directing the economic activity within the nation. The government sets these production targets, allocates these resources, and regulates the price for the people within that society. So it's all controlled by the government. And then finally, we have more of a mixed economy. And this is going to be a blend of our market and command economies because those are kind of the extremes. What we see most common in this world is going to be a mixed economy, which is a combination of private enterprise with government intervention. These are some big words, so if they're hard to memorize, remember it's going to be based on the market, which is us, the people, consumers, and also the government. So this balances the efficiency of the market economies with the social welfare goals of command economies, because oftentimes market economies can leave some people in the dust because it's only set by the market, while command economies don't really foster this competition and innovation as much. So a mixed economy, we're able to see the maximized efficiency of both.
Perfect. Woo! All right, we're
Ooh.
cruising right along. Next up is economic sectors. I know these can get confusing. One way to think about it is like, think about that commodity chain that we talked about with strawberries. You know, like we can kind of use the example of strawberries even throughout, and like what exactly is needed, what kinds of businesses are needed along the way.
That's a good example. And so these are a little hard, but I'm going to do my best to try and help you guys really differentiate these. So the first is going to be the primary sector, which is going to be the process of extracting the natural resources in each nation. So examples of these are agriculture itself, farming from the land, mining into the caves or wherever people mine, and forestry, going into the forest, taking wood, just really utilizing the natural resources and gaining your economy from them. It's often characterized with low levels of mechanization and technology, and these are often very labor intensive because it's a lot of hard work out in the nature. Our next economic sector is going to be secondary. So this is where we process these raw materials we may have gotten from our primary sector, which includes manufacturing and building. These can also be characterized as having a higher level of mechanization because we're going to be manufacturing, but it also requires special skills and training as compared to the primary sector, because in order to manufacture and build, we have to have these special skills. Now, the next sector is going to be the tertiary sector, which is going to be where we bring the finished goods to the consumers. This is really your point of contact within sales. So this can include, again, as listed, retail, transportation, wholesale, even education and hospitality, I think, are within this sector, because it's really characterized with this high level of this interpersonal interaction, which requires people to interact with each other, and really, like, we see where the consumers meet the demand of the whatever product is being sold or whatever service is coming to you guys. Our fourth section is going to be, I don't know how to pronounce this, the
Quaternary
sector. This is where business services to sell more, which is basically where we create some of the knowledge and information as well. A lot of times we see the finance sectors, real estate, and marketing sectors in this, but I also believe that we see sometimes some technology services in there as well if you want some more modern applications. This sector really relies heavily on high levels of specialization and expertise, which is why we've seen it later within our industrialization process, because it involves a lot of advanced education and training. If you're going into finance and you have to learn all these skills about numbers, math, money, and how the world works, this obviously is going to require a lot of specialization, which is why we see it in a later economic sector. And then finally, we have the quinary sector, I believe is what it's called, which really is going to focus on consumer services, which include the government, education, and healthcare. A lot of times, policy making and decision making can be grouped into this section. And it's also really focused on leadership and strategic planning that does, again, require the specialized expertise that we can see in the quaternary section. However, we see a more focus on this like high level decision making and more doing good, I'd say, to the public in this sector.
So, like, one thing to keep in mind with this is that there's a lot of overlap, right? Because similar industries are sort of needed for different stages. So, for example, like if you really take that, like, strawberry example, you've got the primary one where they're like, picking the strawberries, the secondary one where they're making the jam. The tertiary one is like all the stores where they're actually selling the jam. Things like quaternary is more like who's doing the marketing for it, right? Like who's like trying to do like all the different like services that the business needs to be able to sell more. And then the last one is like all these other services that the people who are going to buy the jam, they also need these other things too to like be healthy. So there is some overlap. That's why you see like education, for example, in more than one, because sometimes you need education to like get to make sure the consumers know about the thing. It's less about like consumer service, but more about the like what part of the cycle is that in.
I see a question on stage. Is research quaternary or quinary? This is kind of hard. Maybe if Amanda has a better answer, because personally, I think it could technically be in both. It depends on the research, because I think more research institutions and bigger databases are in quinary, but like research itself can be in quaternary, is what I think I recall.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So like think about like with quaternary, it's like these are services to the businesses to help them sell more things. So plenty of customer research is needed for that. Things like market research would for sure fit into that. But when you think about consumer services, things like policy, right? Things like educational health research, like there's so much that goes into keeping us, happy, healthy, alive. Those types of things are more in the quaternary sector. So research is a function that probably in some cases happens at many of the levels, but I would say teachers would be more in the quinary, unless we're all saying tertiary.
I think, let me think back to when I was in this. I think education technically under College Board is within tertiary. But I think higher education, such as colleges, will be seen in quinary, but like more lower level educations will be in tertiary sector.
Okay. See how it's like, it's a fine line. It's a super fine line. So just really don't just think about the job, the title of the job. Think about what is it that this person is doing? What are they doing in terms of like, when it comes to these different industries? Where do they fit in that case?
That's a good way to remember it.
Yeah. All right. We're shifting gears into measures of development here. So we gave ourselves a little note. There are a lot of them. When you're trying to, examine the world and look at like how we're doing as a global society, there's a lot of different ways that you can talk about this. And to even give you an example of this, like actually a real world example, you are experiencing this week one measure of development of yourself. And this is your AP Human Geography score, right? So like one way that we could look at education is how do students do on the AP exam? But as you all know, that one score does not tell the whole story, right? It tells one story. It's very specifically, how did you do on that one test that one day, right? But there's all these other things that play a factor into that, which is like your teachers, your school, your parents, your guys are talking about like what book did you buy, like all of these things play a factor into that. And so when you think about measures of development, it's just looking at how can we assess how we're doing, but keep in mind that every measure of development is just one snapshot, right? It's just one look at it where it doesn't tell the whole story. None of them do. You need many of them in order to like really understand how are we doing. If we want to really understand how you're doing in school, you might want to look at a lot of factors, right? You would actually want to, not just your AP scores, you're going to want to look at a whole bunch of pieces of the puzzle to really understand like what is going on here and where are there places for improvement. So definitely keep that in mind as we go through this. So we're going to go through a bunch of different snapshots, but each one is just like, it's just another piece of the puzzle.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah. These are a little difficult, but I think as long as you have a basic idea of what they are, you got this. So let's go over gross domestic product, which is often referred to as the GDP, which is ultimately the market value of goods and services. This is going to be, usually this for more complex, if you want, it's going to be the value of the goods and services produced in the country in a given period, so per year. And it's often used to refer to a country's economic strength, and it's used to compare it to other countries to see the economic performances of different countries. Like in this graph, we can see that the scale from like a lighter orange to a black, all of the countries that have this black color have a giant GDP. This is going to be their nominal GDP in billions in the US dollar. And so as we can see, a lot of times when we look at North America, we can see that there's a lot of high GDPs within this range. However, when we go to places such as Africa, a lot of these countries have a lower GDP in the US dollar, which means they have a lower production of goods and services per year within that country. And this is probably the most common way to evaluate a country's economic standing in terms of comparison to other countries.
All right, so we're going to keep going, but if you have questions about GDP, just pop them in the chat. The next one.
The gross national income, again noted as the GNI. So this is going to be the income generated by citizens. So this is a measure of the total amount of income earned by a country's residents and businesses, regardless of where they are located. So this can include income from foreign sources, such as profits from foreign investments and earnings of citizens living abroad. But this is really income-based. It's not based on the production or services or anything of a country. It's based on how much the residents in that country are making. I think what a lot of people struggle with is differentiating the GDP and the GNI, but how I like to really compare and contrast the two is that, again, the GDP only takes into account the economic activity that occurs within a country's borders. And this includes, like, basically your keyword is going to be production within that country, while the GNI takes into account the income in a country's residents of both and businesses, both within the country and outside of it. So the GNI technically encompasses more, because if you're a US citizen and you happen to be working overseas and produce things overseas, that's going to go into your GNI, but not GDP. And that's really how you're going to differentiate them. And I think it's common to use GNI in some situations because the US and other countries often have factories in other countries. So if the US company operates a factory that's within, for example, Mexico, and makes profits from that factory, the profits of that factory are going to be included within Mexico's GDP, but not in the US GDP. But when we're looking at GNI, the profits from that factory are going to be reported in the US's GNI, as because this is owned and operated and income from the US residents and businesses, but it may not be included at the upper level of the GNI for Mexico, and instead only the salaries of those working in the factory will be reported for the GNI in Mexico, if that makes sense. That's kind of the simplest example I can think of.
Yeah, it definitely makes sense. I know it definitely can get kind of confusing, but it's like if there are for GDP, it's like really focus on the like anything that is produced in this country, what is the market value of it? Right? So like of all the things that are produced, this is how much it's worth. In this one, it's like it does kind of take that into account, but it's like now if we look at how much are people actually making, it's a little bit different because now you can include like, you know, maybe you're selling products internationally and that would then get included. So definitely a little bit confusing, but I think we got it.
You guys got this. Okay.
Well, this was a good question. Would remittances be a part of the GDP then? So
I don't think so, because GDP really just focuses on production when you get to it technically. And since that isn't like going at like I take econ, so it's like I know like all the steps. I'm trying to think in terms of human geography. I don't think it would be a part of it because there's like a big equation for GDP, but you guys don't even know that.
Yeah. Human geography really sets you up for a lot of other classes. So if you're going to take econ, you're going to be ready to go.
Yeah.
All right. Some couple of ones that I think are a little bit easier of just like, these are also just measures of development. So remember, we're just looking to see like how does each country match up? How do they compare to each other? With literacy rates, this is a little bit less, it's less econ.
Yeah, literacy rates are basically just going to be the proportion of the population that has the ability to read and write, usually at like a fluent level. So as you can see, usually this is like a correlation. More developed countries are going to have this higher literacy rate, where more individuals in that country have the skills of reading and writing basic in the nation's language. And then we see in some lesser developed countries, we see a lower level of that population being able to read and write. And this is pretty important for a country's overall development. As we can see within the business world, especially within econ, when we're looking at Unit 7, is that a lot of time this businesses, trade, and just general skills, a lot of these jobs you need to be able to read and write. And so bridging the gap in the literacy rate in a lot of these countries is a very crucial problem that a lot of organizations are working to solve. But it's important to kind of see the map and see where it's getting better, where it's a little weaker.
Perfect. Yeah, and there's a huge like gender gap within this too, especially in the countries that have lower literacy rates. That does come up in this unit. One of the like, I don't know, historical fun facts that I actually really like. It's just like documentary. I'll have to find the link of it. But when this relates to industrialization, when the washer and dryer came about in the 50s, 60s, I'm not sure exactly when, but basically at that moment, there was this hike in women's literacy rates. Because basically what you get is like when you live in a place where you have to be active in, day-to-day like tasks, like getting food, cooking food, literally washing your clothes, like when you have to be able to do these things, you don't have the time to read or write or to learn how to do those things potentially. As soon as those things, some of those tasks become automated for you, it frees up time to then do these kinds of things. So I like that as an example of just like how technology affects what we're able to do. And even as we're looking ahead to the future, like if AI takes up, all of a sudden it used to take us hours and hours and hours to write or read or research things. All of a sudden that stuff is just done. What will that open up the ability to do? Of course, it's going to like really like widen the gap in here, but it's at least like one way to look at it. Okay, so we'll go to the next one. I know that y'all are talking through why developed countries have higher literacy rates in the chat, which is awesome.
Yeah.
This is a wild map.
This is a map that is a little interesting to look at because oftentimes, I'll explain it first. Access to free healthcare. So this is a map that basically shows where healthcare, the ability to get medical attention that's really accessible, all of those countries are going to be green. And then countries with no access to free healthcare for its population are going to be that like pale color. And so a lot of times this is interesting to look at because oftentimes we see the United States as a country that is going to be economically powerful, very developed. But sometimes people also think access to free healthcare is something that is a sign of a developed nation. And it's something that where you're able to see a lot of times the population, no matter their income, when we see that wealth gap and classism, have the same equal opportunities for access. But when we look at healthcare, in terms of healthcare, we can see a lot of these more developed countries lacking and some of these lesser developed countries really excelling in this access. So it's kind of cool to look at this.
Yeah. So the gray ones are free healthcare for some. So there may be some. I'm not sure exactly what the laws look like there, but it's some people get access to it, and it's just like this is why this is so important. So like when you look at the other maps, you can see the U.S. is on sort of the like far end of the spectrum from those, with like a high GDP, a high GNI, high literacy rates. But then you like look at the map like this and you're like, well, like it's not all right. So like not all one measure of development doesn't tell the whole story. You need to tell all of it. Let's see. How do medical people get paid if it's all free? Through the government. The government will pay for it. All right, another one. Life expectancy. This one's
Okay.
easy.
Yeah, this is easy. Just basically, how long will people live in this area? And for the map, it's just going to be an example of the United States instead of the whole nation, because as we can see, even within the US, there is going to be these differences in life expectancy. Now, this can come from a multitude of factors, such as like your situation, access to healthcare again, living in a rural or an urban area. There's just a lot of different access to food because we know about food deserts. Just a lot of these different traits go into determining someone's life expectancy. So we can see a lot of differences even within the states.
Yeah, in this map, the darkest red, the life expectancy is in the 60s. The darkest blue, the life expectancy is in the 80s. Literally a 20-year gap. It's just kind of mind blowing. All right, one more. Human Development Index.
Okay, so this is going to be basically something that's often referred to in human geography, I believe, and also a lot of other AP classes. But this is going to assess your a country's long-term progress in health, education, and standard living. It's going to be this composite measure of all of these different factors. And it really assesses these three because a lot of times those are really important to look at a country's overall success because different cultures and different nations have different targets when they're developing economically. So this is really used to really assess a country's level of development, but mostly overall well-being is when we really look at the HDI.
Perfect. It's as if somebody made a huge spreadsheet of all the maps we just showed you and some, and then, all of a sudden they're computing an actual number.
Okay. The next is going to be the Gini coefficient, which is something that is going to measure the level of income disparity and within a country. This is like basically, I think it's an equation, and it basically ranges from 0 to 1, where 0 represents perfect equality, where everyone in that country has the same income, and 1 representing perfect inequality, which is where no one has the same income. Everyone has different incomes and everyone else has, oh wait, I spelled that wrong. Sorry, I'm going back to it. Yes, okay, 1 is actually representing perfect inequality where one person has all the income and everyone else has none. Sorry, I got confused with something else. So just to reiterate, 0 is perfect equality, everyone has the same income, and 1 is perfect inequality, where one person has all the income and everyone else has none in a country, if that makes sense. And then along the scale, we can see just like different variations in between the income distributions within a different country. So this is used more to really look at the each specific country income and economic social inequality, as levels of high income inequality can lead to social unrest and things like political instability, while things of more, if you have better income equality, we can see that there's going to be higher standards of living for more of the population within that country. And so it's basically plotted, as you can see, kind of like in the top right corner. It's going to be plotting the cumulative income shares of the population against the cumulative population shares. I don't believe you have to actually know that, but that's just kind of why it's in that like kind of curved shape rather than just like different graphs.
Yeah, so a couple of the questions in the chat were like, doesn't this just plot the government itself, like capitalist versus communist versus, well, there aren't really any pure communist countries, but doesn't it just plot these things versus, or doesn't it plot gender? And remember, like something like income has a lot of factors within it, right? Like what kinds of jobs do you have available to you? Are you literate? What's your, like, I don't know, like, do you have the means to have like to lead, like take care of people at home? Like there's all these different things that are part of it. And so when you actually look at income disparity, like the actual, like, so what is income disparity? This is like the gap between incomes. How wide is it between the people who make low amounts versus people who make high amounts? Is there a huge gap versus small gap? Okay, I think we got all the questions in there. I know there's some questions about Greenland. Greenland just like doesn't technically part of Denmark, but nobody really, like, there are people that live there, but it's very, very small. So there's usually not enough data. Is a high number bad here? So in this case,
basically the higher number, the more unequal your economies are. So as you can see, there's that like yellow highlighted section and the graph. So basically what that is going to be is the distance between the line of perfect equality, which is going to be where your Gini coefficient is 0, where everyone has the same income. So as you can see, the yellow part is going to be the amount of inequality within wages that your country has, or just general resources. And so we can see the greater the distance, the greater the inequality, and thus the higher the number, so the closer your number is to 1, the more inequality of income you have within your country. That's kind of how you can like visualize it with those little graphs in the corner.
perfect. Okay, we have a couple of other measures of development, and then we're going to take a break.
Okay, these aren't as heavily tested within AP Human, so we're going to keep these a little more quick and simple. So first, we can see the Gender Development Index, which is going to be, it measures the gender inequalities with literacy, healthcare, and life expectancy within the country. It's basically going to be measuring a composite measure of a country's gender-related development based on the same factors as we went over earlier in the HDI, but this is going to be more focused on gender equality and inequality, as that has been a rising issue around the world. The next is going to be the multidimensional poverty index, which measures the percent of households lacking money, education, and basic infrastructure services. What we can see here, it takes into account a lot of factors. A lot of times it also takes into account of education, access to healthcare, and living standards. And it's really used to look at the depth of poverty within a country that government officials can use to see where their country is with terms of poverty and how they can best go about solving it. And finally, we'll go over the Environmental Performance Index, which has become increasingly popular because of the world's focus on helping the environment. So this is going to ultimately measure a country's environmental performance based on factors such as air and water quality and terms of solving climate change. This is used to address the country's environmental sustainability level and its commitment to just helping our climate. Yeah.
Ooh, lots of measures of development. Hopefully there aren't too many questions about this, but I think we've got all the measures of development down. And about that time for a break, so we can go drink some water, stretch, catch up on your notes. Let's do it. This video had some music behind it. All right, I'm gonna take a break as well. Drink my Pepsi. I'm just going to come on early and talk about pens. This conversation in the chat. So I found that AP Human Geography is like the first time that you have to experience being like forced to use pens. It's like every other time in your educational history, it was all about pencils, and all of a sudden it's like, use the pen. But I want you guys to just really think about this. Like, mistakes are okay. You are not in your test. You don't have to be perfect. And so if you make a mistake, you cross it out. And it's all good, you know? It's just like so much easier for the readers. So unfortunately the subtitles on my end are not working. I tried to set them up earlier. I really wish that I could. I apologize for that. All right. You ready?
Go. Okay.
Section 2. Look at how many slides we've got. We've got 10. We are going to get into models now for Unit 7. There are a lot. Counting them up once, it's something like in all of AP Human Geo, it's like 30 models you need to know. So here are like 7 of them. First up, Rostow.
All right, so here is your Rostow's stages of development. This is an important model to know, and it's going to be primarily based on US and Europe, and it assumes comparative advantages within countries and disregards colonial legacy. So here are your 5 stages starting at the bottom. The first stage is really when you go in like an order of a society developing is going to be what is known as the traditional society. This is where your economy is going to be based on agriculture and ultimately has limited technology. The majority of the population that is in this place is going to be really engaged in agriculture, and there's not going to be these high levels of industrialization that we see. I think a good example, or I can't name a specific one, but examples of countries in this stage include some parts of sub-Saharan Africa. Those are usually the examples that you'll hear within your textbooks. After this, we come to our next stage, which is going to be the preconditions for takeoff. In this stage, we are going to see an increase in productivity and technology and a shift towards that market economy that we talked about earlier. Examples of countries that are going to be in this stage include, we kind of have to go back in time to maybe the 1980s and 1990s, which it could be like India within that time frame, or even China, I think is often referred to. Now that we've kind of had our precondition for takeoff, we go into the stage of takeoff. In this stage, we really see this rapid growth in industrialization and the economy really developing, which is why it's kind of called takeoff. You kind of have this build up and finally you get a takeoff, you get to go. And so here we see this shift in manufacturing and exports and infrastructure development. A good example of this include, we can see back in history within these like an Asian tiger really taking off is going to be South Korea within the 1960s and 1970s. After its war, it was finally able to redevelop and really boom, and its economy was able to grow really quickly. Next, we see the next stage, which is going to be the drive to maturity. So this is after we see that rapid growth, we really see the economy continuing to grow. However, we really see this focus on innovation, diversification, and an investment on human capital. So we can see a lot of this focus going into other places within our economy and within our overall growth. And I think an example of this, again, a lot of the examples I know off the top of my head are historical, but we can include Mexico within the 1980s for kind of this, as we can see that they just had their boom and now they're really focusing on human capital innovation and just really solidifying their economy. And then finally, we really see the high mass consumption stage, also referred to as the age of mass consumption. And in this stage, we can see where the economy is ultimately going to be driven by consumer demand, and there's going to be this focus on services and technological development and technology. This is what we can see a lot of within probably our everyday lives, because examples of this are going to be the United States and the Japan, especially in the post-World War II era, is when we really see this come to go. Because again, we can see that the economy's main driving factors are going to be the demand, and it has that special focus on those things we see from industrialization, such as technology. I think something that's good to know are some of the criticisms of Rostow's stage that we kind of went over a little bit while introducing it, but not as in depth. And I think an important criticism is going to be how it oversimplifies the complex process of economic development. And it doesn't take into account any of the unique histories and cultures and development practices of different countries. But it does provide a useful framework for understanding this process. So a lot of times people will still refer to this model. Does the economic okay question?
Oh, go ahead.
Oh yeah, okay. Do the economic sectors align with these stages? For example, is a traditional society likely a primary sector or a sector country? So I think this is a valid question. I think it's hard to necessarily define because, again, Rostow's stages really oversimplify development. But I would say that a lot of times we can see that overlap because, again, when we're looking at the traditional society that's really based on agriculture, we can compare it to the primary sectors and primary stages of the economic sector. So they there's like some not complete overlap, but again, we can see that a lot of similarities will go into each. If you had another example, Amanda, or if that was a good explanation, I'm not sure.
No, that's definitely a good example. The problem with this model is it's just linear. Like not every country is going to go through the exact same steps in the exact same order, in the same way, right? Like it just sort of that piece around like it assumes that there is this like comparative advantage, so that means that there has to be this differentiator for that country, and it just completely disregards like colonialism. So places that were colonized don't have a path that's this linear towards being more developed. And so it's when you think about this case, so some of the things that it's talking about in here in terms of like preconditions for takeoff, it's actually like it is referring to some of the other types of conditions that society would need in order to get to that point of high mass consumption. So you need things like stable political environment. You need things like stable economy in terms of like the dollar, right? Like what is your currency? Think about what a high mass consumption society needs. It needs people who are going to make purchases, right? So do you have the conditions for that? Do people have the jobs that they need? Do people have the access to, stable life that they need in order to move up the ranks in this case? So think about that when it's like preconditions for takeoff, drive to maturity. What is included within this? Like what is actually happening in order to get the country economically moving up has to do with all the other things. Like think about like the population pyramids. Does this country have enough of a working age population in order to like develop and manufacture enough of the goods in order to become a high mass consumption society? Or are they a graying culture, or are they're too young, right? So think about those types of conditions in terms of preconditions. Takeoff is like, all right, we got it. We got the ball rolling. Drive to maturity. Now you're going to need to really like, smooth the edges out. It's not a great model. It's like it's just really simplified. It's just like, and then you do this, and then you do this. But it's like nothing is this linear. It's just not as clear. We will talk about complementary versus comparative in a bit. All right, I think we've got it for this one. Let's jump to the next one.
So now we're going into our world systems theory, and some good definitions are going to be core, which is going to be first world, more developed countries, and then periphery, which are going to be the third world, lesser developed countries. It's a lot of definitions go into this. But basically, we're going to look at the world system theory, which is going to be a theory of economic development that really suggests that the global economy is kind of divided into this system, which is going to include like the graphic in the corner. It's going to include those core, semi-periphery, and periphery countries. So again, this theory was developed by Wallerstein, I forget when, and it ultimately suggests that our economy for the globe is based in this way that benefits the most powerful nations at the expense of the least powerful nations. Thus, where we see those core, semi-periphery, and periphery.
Yeah.
Should I go in more depth, or is that a good example?
Yeah, so we're going to get into the dependency theory in a second, which is essentially like kind of based on this. But when you look at this chart up in the top corner, you can really see how like the core companies, this says high profit consumption goods. They're making a lot of money off of everybody else, right? So in this case, the US, Canada, Europe, Western Europe, Australia. Remember the GDP map, right? Remember the GNI map? They actually look very similar. Because where is all that money coming from? In this case, this whole model is like they're making the money off of these other countries. They're selling, their goods back to these countries. Whereas the countries in the periphery, which on this map are yellow, they are providing the cheap labor and raw materials. In a lot of cases, the countries in the yellow on here used to be colonized, right? These are the countries that are dealing with the legacy of colonization. And then the semi-periphery are kind of this like in between. Many of those countries also used to be colonized, not all of them. They're sort of like kind of the in between of like they have become a little bit more developed. They may have other types of agreements with other countries, but they're not. So they're kind of in that in between state where they sort of are. They're buying the goods from the core. They're also providing labor to the core. So they're kind of the in between state. And they also are selling some goods to the periphery. Yeah, it's just a mouthful of vocab. I will note though that like I put first world and third world on here. Those terms are really not used anymore, but you will see them. You won't see them on the test, but I know that sometimes you may have seen them in class. So I just wanted you to be able to like relate this as well.
Okay, and then the next thing that kind of bounces off of that is going to be the dependency theory, where ultimately what we have to understand is that these lesser developed countries are in this cycle of dependency. They are dependent on these more developed countries for money, infrastructure, resources. Basically, there's a lot of different things that they are reliant on. It's kind of like a comparison that you may be familiar with, hopefully, is like you're a kid and your parents. You are dependent on your parents. Oftentimes, these lesser developed countries are so dependent on these more developed countries. And what we can see from a result of this is that a lot of times transnational corporations benefit more developed countries, but they exploit these lesser developed countries in return. I think there's a lot of examples that we can see throughout history, such as the US in relation to many countries in Latin America. We can see that the US has historically played this really dominant role in shaping the economies and the policies and just everything in these countries. However, they've done this at a cost, and for these countries, they've somewhat exploited them for the US's own economic interest. And now we can see a lot of these countries are still really reliant and dependent on the US for support because they haven't been able to really find ways or get the right resources and infrastructures to be able to support themselves without that external help. So again, it's a cycle. It keeps continuing.
Exactly. Yeah. So just again, like think back to some of those other maps and you can see how if we kind of overlap them, it's starting to tell this bigger story. Right. So like this like massive red dot up here in the US. The US has 21,000 of the world's biggest transnational corporations headquartered in the US.
And I see a question, what is a transnational corporation? That's going to be a business, a corporation that operates in multiple countries. It's kind of like a powerhouse business. There's going to be a lot. I'm trying to think of an example. There's like tons of examples.
Literally like any of your most used apps. Like this is like, Netflix, Nike, Apple, Pepsi. We all use all these things all the time. They seep into our culture. many times they are like housing their factories outside of the US. But so think about the sectors, right? The things, in order to build the iPhone, in order to build your shoes, all these things, a lot of those resources are coming from other countries. They're being, mined and like exploited, right, from other countries, and then manufactured in other countries. That's your outsourcing. I saw someone put that in there. But the types of sectors that those companies will house in the US are the higher level ones, right? Their marketing team may be based in the US. Their CEO is based in the US, like all the like higher levels of that corporation. And then where does all that money go, right? Like the money of that company is going to be sort of based in wherever this dot is. Europe has obviously a lot of them too. So does China, Japan, and Asia. There are many of them across the world. But in terms of transnational corporations, just literally think of any product that you know is a popular product. Any app, any food, drink, clothing, makeup, like whatever it is, toys. If it's something that's really big, it's probably transnational. The world's getting smaller.
Okay, the next is going to be Weber's theory of industrial location. You may have heard this more often referred to as the least cost theory or just Weber's least cost theory, which basically is going to be utilizing locations for land, labor, and factory to minimize costs. It's going to be more of a strategic plan where you can like have these optimal locations in order to really minimize the costs of different productions and activities that you have based on the locations of inputs and markets. So I think something important to note here is kind of like the graphic, if you can read the little things. You kind of want to have that optimal location between where you're getting your resources, where you're producing or manufacturing or anything, and where you're actually distributing these resources, because these all three involve transportation, which involves time, money, resources, and everything. So you really want to put yourself in that position where you're in the best location to really service all of these different considerations. It also is going to depend on just like weight losing or weight gaining manufacturing. So this is going to be where manufacturing has different steps based on the product you're making. So sometimes when you're in the process of making something, you can have a really heavy thing to begin with, like lumber or wood. You have a lot of wood. But throughout the manufacturing process, the end product may be a lot lighter than the original materials you started out with. So this is going to affect your mode of transportation because weight affects transportation. So again, that's a factor to consider. Or you could have the opposite, where you're combining a bunch of different resources together to make a product, and that could add weight to the finalized product. So these different weights affect your transportation, modes of transportation, and time of transportation. So you want to be able to account for those when you're positioning yourself in order to minimize these costs and maximize efficiency when you're choosing that industrial location.
Exactly. Basically, you're trying to make the most money you can. So in order to do that, you got to spend as little as possible and make the most as possible. This is pure capitalism, right? So like, just like if the raw goods are heavy, then you need to put your factory close to where you're going to get the raw goods. Otherwise, it's going to cost you a lot to transport them. If the final product is heavy, then you want to put it closer to where you're going to sell them. Same thing matters with like who you're going to hire, right? If you need a lot of labor that's really specialized, then you need to make sure that they can. This doesn't assume any kind of remote work, by the way, but you need to assume that they can get to where your offices, your manufacturing, your factory is, right? You need to be able to hire people, like the best people you can at the cheapest costs, and produce the materials and produce the actual thing you're going to sell at the cheapest cost. There's a lot of math involved in here. I don't think you need to know, like, I'm not sure if you need to know the actual.
I don't think you need to know the actual calculations. That's something that goes into like deeper level courses, but
This isn't the math class. All right.
Okay.
This is really well positioned here because this is like based on that.
Yeah. So we're going to go into agglomerations and growth poles. So an agglomeration is basically going to be something that is a concentration of economic activity. It's going to be where everything is just kind of like in this one specific region or area. And this could be due to a lot of factors such as access to resources, again, the transportation, infrastructure, and just where people are, where people decide to just go together and get together. I think some good examples of this are going to be in New York City. We can see that the city itself is a giant agglomeration, or maybe even London. These are going to be these dense concentrations of people where economic activities in finance, media, any industry really is going to be very, very adamant. And we can see a lot of times these businesses will benefit from these because of the large pool of skilled worker, the transportation accesses, and just the general resources you get from being in this cluster. On the other hand, we can see a growth pole is going to refer to a specific region or area that is targeted for economic development by the government and policymakers. We can see that growth poles are characterized by these high levels of investment, infrastructure, education, and other resources in the aim of attracting businesses to move there and creating these jobs. We can see that Stanford, an example in that area, is going to be a growth pool because it was trying to attract tech companies and investors into the Silicon Valley. Or even within the Great Lakes, this is going to be a growth pool because there's a cost advantage to manufacturing cars. So this may not be as dense of an area. However, it's often something that has influence from the government and policymakers, or even within businesses who just choose to like have the resources there or somewhere that's really resource heavy. That is going to be a pull factor, as we learned earlier, for these businesses to go to these different areas and thus utilize these areas for their benefit. It isn't as dense as a agglomeration.
So, to give some more examples on this, like as discussed in the chat too, like agglomerations are these like clustering of similar companies, right? It is where you get a lot of the same types of companies in the same location. Because think about like back to this slide, if there's a perfect location for something, your perfect distance between where you need to hire people, maybe there's a college right there or a town that is like attracting people like that are in a certain industry. There's a, you can get access to all the materials you need. You're not going to be the only one that figures out this is where we should put our business. Plenty of other people are going to do the same thing, right? Like this doesn't really, where your business is could only really be like an advantage for you if nobody else can do it. But that's that's not going to happen. And so in this case, it's like, just think about like, if you want to work in entertainment, you're going to look at LA, right? If you want to work on Broadway, you're going to work in New York. If you're going to want to work in tech, these are very simplified things, like again, pre-remote work. But in terms of like Silicon Valley, like if you're going to work in tech, you've got tech companies everywhere. You've got investors everywhere. Like there's literally a street called Sand Hill Road in Silicon Valley that has all of the major tech investors right there. So if you're raising money, all of a sudden it's like so easy. Now you have the easiest access to capital if you're right there. So for all of these things, just think of examples of like, if there's a perfect place to run a certain industry, it's extremely likely that you're going to get many different examples of businesses that are popping up there. And they share employees, right? Someone might quit one job, they go work at another one. I already have the skills, right? They share like manufacturers, they share transportation costs, even they can share all of it. Kind of gets into economies of scale. I don't know that we had like a whole slide on that, but this is essentially that.
Yeah. Oh, and I think another example that I think I remember it being like, at least on my test, is something to note is that growth pools can be a strategy that different governments use to, if per se. Everyone's leaving. Like, oh no, it's kind of like brain drain. Everyone's leaving my place. No one wants to work here. So instead, a government or anyone in a position of power can really incentivize more people or businesses to come to their certain area by providing these resources. And I think an example I talked about a lot in my class back in the day was this thing in North Carolina, I believe, and it was about research, which is like very random, but they were just losing a lot of people. They wanted to go to more urban areas. So instead, they really created this area that had a lot of like resources. And there's like going to be those universities that are well known, like Duke, the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and all these big universities were kind of strategically placed to provide a range of resources for research and development to attract more people into the state because they were all just leaving. So
Yeah.
that was something I remember being popular when I took the test in my class.
They'll do things like for example, some states like Oklahoma, South Dakota, I'm sure there's other ones too. I think like I just read about this with Tulsa. Like some of these states are trying to convince young like people in their 20s to move there even if they work remotely. And the way that they do that is by just like paying them basically. And so you create these incentives to get people to do that. And then that will also, the idea is that that will also bring business because now you've got, if you have this like cluster of people that are all looking for the same thing, then it's a really good idea to go sell to them right there.
Mm-hmm. And so simply put, the best way to remember this is going to be an agglomeration is a big cluster, really dense area. I think New York City, where there's a variety of industries, just everyone's there. It's an urban hub. While growth pools, there's not going to be as a condensed population or amount of businesses. However, it's going to be more specialized in the industry, which is a pull factor to go there. So like agglomeration, basically everything, everyone, all in one place, while a growth pool is more specialized and is going to try and attract these people to come there for that specialized industry.
I think the growth pool sort of attracts the agglomeration.
That's a good connection.
All right.
Okay, next we're going to go into trade specialization of production. And so basically these are important factors for a place's economic development because it allows countries to maximize their productions of goods and services that they're best suited for to trade with other countries for goods and services that they also need, but may not be able to produce efficiently for themselves due to a lack of resources, a lack of labor, a lack of skill, or basically any other reason that they may have. So let's first look into comparative advantage. So this is going to be a theory that ultimately suggests that countries should specialize in producing services or goods that they're efficient at producing. They should produce goods that they're able to produce cheaply, that they have the resources and natural resources to produce, because it just makes more sense for them as a person. Like if you were really good at math and your friend was really good at English and you weren't good at English, you may choose to be a tutor in math instead of English because you have that ability and the skills to do this efficiently, while your friend may choose to be a tutor in English because, again, they don't have those math skills, but they have that so-called comparative advantage in English. So that really shapes the services that you two choose to offer. And it really helps ultimately in trade because each country is able to have their own specialization that they have this comparative advantage in, and thus they can all trade with each other and specialize what they're good at, what they're really able to make for cheaper, and trade it for things that they need. The next is going to be the complementary advantage. So this is ultimately a concept that is suggesting that countries can benefit from specializing in different stages of production and trading intermediate goods and services with each other. And this is going to be like two specializations that complement each other. So they trade instead of compete. If this is a little harder to wrap your head around, but it basically allows a country to really focus in on producing goods and services, again, that they're best suited to, similar to the comparative advantage. But the key difference here is going to be that they are going to, sorry, I'm trying to figure out how to explain this simply because
it's tough.
It's like, yeah.
You can think of this on a grand scale with countries, but you can also think of it just like with companies too. So with a comparative advantage, it's like every company needs some reason as to why people are going to buy their services versus their competitors, right? So either they're cheaper, they're better, like they have to hit something, right? A complementary advantage is like instead of directly competing. You just are like, okay, you do this part, I'll do this part, and we can kind of like trade those pieces to each other. And that way we don't have to compete on the things that we're not good at. You just sort of lean into the things that you find a buddy, and then you just like trade that. So think about like, producing anything, or I'm even trying to think of like, even like in tech, like if you try to think of some examples of like, when you like buy one thing and you get this other thing for free, you get this like other feature, this other like app, whatever. It's like the companies have basically decided, okay, we're not going to build that feature. You're really good at it. We are really good at this thing. So instead of competing against each other, let's offer both of our services to the consumer, and now they can just buy it once, get both of them, and we both win, right? Now we both got money because we both got to sell our services, but we focused on how we complement each other rather than how we're going to compete.
I think the example my teacher used when I learned this was relating different countries. It can be like any country, but remember a big one is Saudi Arabia with a lot of different countries. I think let's just choose like Japan. So Saudi Arabia has large reservations of oil and natural gases, which are a hot item on the market, while Japan, because of its location, doesn't have a lot of these natural resources, but instead it has a lot of advanced manufacturing capabilities and skilled workers. So we can see that Saudi Arabia and Japan can benefit from each other. So this is more of a mutual benefit when we look at the complementary advantage and see that Saudi Arabia can produce its oil and natural resources like it always does and trade with Japan, which can use those resources and turn it into a finished product and export those products back to Saudi Arabia or other countries that may not have as specialized manufacturing but have those natural resources. So that's kind of like a real world example.
That's super good. Yeah, I know. So they're very like kind of similar. You just have to really think about what the words mean, comparative versus complementary. It's like, just complementary is just like we're working together. Comparative advantage is like me versus you. Like I'm going to say like I am this and you are that, Okay. Moving right along. We've got a couple more slides. I think we've got 4 more.
Okay.
And then we'll do a Unit 7 quiz.
All right, perfect, guys. So let's go into free trade zones, which are basically going to be your regional agreements that have the goal of increasing this international trade. Some really big ones to know are going to be the EU, European Union, the World Trade Organization, WTO, Mercosur, and then OPEC, which encompass different countries in those areas to just increase trade. These are often these geographic areas and just due to ease of access and trade. But the reason why these are important is because they allow for fewer trade barriers and lower taxes when these countries are trading with each other. Now, each organization of like trade countries has like some different standards and different benefits, but the ultimate thing that you have to know is that they're established by the governments in order to promote this economic growth and attract foreign investment and just really make trade for businesses residing within these countries easier. It streamlines regulations, it reduces tariffs, which is basically like taxes placed on countries in order to trade goods and services. And it also sometimes can create this access to specialized infrastructure and services. So it's good for the businesses, it's good for trade, and it's good for the economies of these countries.
Yeah, and the consumers, because then the goods themselves are cheaper if they're within that region. Mercosur, I don't know how to actually pronounce it, but it's the South American free trade zone. This map is from 2009, so some of these are no longer called these things. So I kind of highlighted for you up top here the ones that you should know. All right.
All right, and then kind of similar to that, but not exactly the same thing, are going to be these special economic zones, which are these designated areas where they have these economic protections and really incentives that help attract this foreign investment, promote economic growth, and create jobs ultimately. They have these special economic regulations and policies that are going to be different from the rest of the country. And so examples of these are the most common examples are going to be exclusive economic zones, which are often referred to as EEZs. And these are the coastal jurisdictions that a country has. I think there's somewhat seen on the map. You can see them. There's places where a lot of times you see this trade happening from ships or different kinds, like big boats coming in with different goods and services, and this trade happening there. So what we can see is that there's this kind of like fight over this coastal jurisdiction, and ultimately they've come with this idea of having this. It's ultimately a special economic zone. So I'm a little more shaky on this topic.
Yeah. It's essentially like, even when you're in the water here, if you're 200 nautical miles out, you're still in that country. And so this is just adding sort of like that border around everything. There are plenty of shared borders here, contested borders. We've talked about borders. These things are very complex and complicated, but it's all about adding different protections and incentives, tax incentives, lower tariff costs. Like, if you're in the water, you're in the ship, like, bringing materials to different places, like where in the world are you? It's sort of essentially that. Versus like the export processing zones where you get specific, it's the same idea. You get these like, barrier-free areas. So in this case, China has just like really pushed for this economic development to happen right on the coast. And so these cities have really attracted a whole lot of workers coming from the more rural areas in Western China. And they are either working in the manufacturing, the factories that are based there, because again, remember the like location. It's good to be based there because you're going to be close to the port, and then the things can be loaded up on the ships and exported out. And so the country can really designate certain areas to have different protections or incentives in this case.
Yeah, and I think that's where we get a lot of these coastal trade hubs and coastal trade cities that they're often referred to in like other AP exams and even AP Human, just because of those protections.
Yes.
And promotion. Yes.
I made a little. This is not really these are not like special zones, but these are like industrial zones that does come up in this. And we talked about this before. So I made a little Frankenstein map for us so that we can see some of the industry belts in the US. It's this is very pieced together. So it's like literally like 4 maps on top of each other. But this came up before and there were a lot of questions about it. So I thought this was a good chance to just like talk about it again. Mm-hmm. So up here you get the Rust Belt. This is like, where you got all those like automobiles and these factories and manufacturing that exists here. The Corn Belt is kind of, sorry for these like really straight lines that are not actually real, but the Corn Belt does like kind of take up a lot of this section. The Wheat Belt up here where more of our wheat is grown. There is actually a Rice Belt down here. And then the rest of the red on the bottom is the Sun Belt, which just literally gets a lot of sun and therefore has certain industries because of it.
Yeah. Oh, and a fun fact, I think the Rust Belt was actually on my FRQ when I took AP Human. It was like a whole question.
Oh, and how did that go?
I personally did really good.
You're like, easy. I got this.
Everyone else in my class had no idea what it was because I did a lot of outside studying. So these pop up. So they're kind of like implied in their name though. Like Rust, think of like manufacturing industries, factories, and then like wheat, obviously you can kind of guess what that is. So it's just implied. Use your best guesses.
All right. Just a few more things. So this is just like notes on offshoring and outsourcing. And then we have one more piece and then we'll do quiz and then a break.
Yep, we saw a lot of questions in other chats about offshoring and outsourcing, so decided to add these slides in. So offshoring ultimately is the practice of moving jobs and the production process to other countries. This is often in search for lower labor costs, other advantages such as more access to natural resources or just lower like land costs for putting up your factory. This is recently become a strategy for many companies to cut down on costs because communication and just technology developments in general has allowed for it to be easier to offshore. I think an example can be just like call centers and different software development has been done overseas within China and India, where labor costs are lower, but the US is still technically in control of these companies. And then on the other hand,
Oops, sorry.
no, it's okay. Outsourcing, oh, that's, I think, yeah. Outsourcing is going to be the direct relocation of a business process or something else to, again, another lower labor cost area. These are ultimately basically like going to be the same thing at the end of the day.
Perfect.
Yep, and the key points just to remember for these two concepts is they are both part of the global economic integration. They increase efficiency and they really impact the economy and spatial patterns of how the economy has developed based on the locations that countries have chose to offshore and outsource their different products.
Perfect. All right. And finally, the way that this unit ends is like, we should probably be more sustainable. That's kind of the way the whole course ends, of like, now that we've talked about everything that has to do with AP Human Geography, here's a nice little wrap up of it.
Yeah.
The UN. Go ahead.
The sustainability goals. There's 17 of them. I don't know how heavily these will be tested, but they are like in the content, like just have a good idea of what you want to be. They were originally adopted in 2015. The ultimate goal of these is just to help people and the planet and protect everything to ensure that there's going to be this prosperity specifically by the year 2030. A lot of these are kind of like basic, no poverty, zero hunger, like clean water, gender equality, just basically everything you could think of to make the world a better place for not only the world itself, but for the people inhabiting it.
There's someone said, just remember that this is what someone would say at a beauty pageant. I'd like to have world peace. Exactly. All right. We have done it. We have gotten through all 7 units. We can now do a fun quiz, because who doesn't love a quiz? And I'm going to just pop this in. Oh my God. Here we go. All right. Oop. That's the wrong. He sent me the link. Press start quiz and then send me that link. The actual URL for that.
I'll send it. Okay, I started the quiz and
then just take the URL in the URL bar.
Okay. Try that, or I'll do the URL bar.
Take the URL bar because it's going to be it'll have like /host in it. Okay,
there's that.
Oh, perfect. All right. Oop. All right, well, we'll start right here. Can we hear the music? Can you hear the music? Okay, good. I can hear the music. Sorry, let me just scroll down so you can see the whole thing, and then I will put. Oh, thank you. All right, we're just joining up. We're answering the questions. Down a little bit. What is the process of transitioning from an agricultural economy to an industrial economy called? I'm about to reveal the answer. We are quite up there. Boom. Oh, you guys, we're getting it. 94% industrialization. Good job. It's so funny that this song is just like a big secret. Okay. We're flying. What is a factor that is part of the secondary economic sector? We gotta get this song on. We keep saying we gotta get this song on Spotify, but I'm not sure if we can. It's The Brazilian samba. So, yes, thank you. There's the link on Pixabay. Reveal. Oh my gosh, y'all are making this look easy. This is not easy. Manufacturing is correct. What are these other ones? Primary. I guess this one would also be secondary. Oh no, this would be primary and primary. Which equation represents GNI? Good luck. Ooh, that drum. I need to find some lyrics. All right. This one was more spread out as I thought it would be. Do you want to help explain this one?
Yeah. Okay, so this is kind of like, sorry, we didn't give you the equation. This is kind of just like making your best guess based on your context clues you got from the lesson. So basically, when we go back to GNI, that's going to be your gross national income. And again, it's the measure of the total income earned by a country. So when we differentiated this from the GDP, the main thing I wanted you guys to remember is that the GNI also encompassed things that were overseas. It encompassed economic activity that is not just going to be within the borders of the state like GDP does. So when we break it down to the possibility of equations, we're going to see that GNI is going to be that GDP that the country has plus the exports minus the imports, because those are going to be the things that externally affect a nation. Those are going to be the things that happen overseas, which is why when you think about it, it's going to be, okay, what is this country's gross national income? It's going to be the GDP, but it's going to be exports that go into it minus imports, because that's what you're giving to other countries. You're going to be losing that. So if that makes sense, think of it from the perspective of having trade with other countries and including that in your overall measurement.
Just one of those things to be memorized. I don't think this equation will be on your test, but really making sure you understand the difference.
Yeah.
All right. Which of the following most likely results from increased women empowerment? Kind of a little bit of a throwback to Unit 2. I feel like it's like the song is just like continuing. Anyways, which of the wow, you guys crushed this one. 96% lower fertility rates. Good. Yeah, the more women's education and literacy rates increase, the lower fertility rates go. All right. What area of China would be considered highly developed or core? Oh, man. Some hard ones. This is fun. This is good. We just talked about this. We are going to take a break after these questions, and then Stephen will be here, joined by Avery and Jessica for FRQ Practice. All right, I'm revealing the answer. Okay, as expected, this one was a little bit spread out, but you guys did a really good job with this one. East. So remember that coastline of China? That's where you get all of this industry based. Okay. What have new organizations like the EU, WTO, and OPEC fostered? Oh, see, I think the music just like played out. I don't think it was restarting each song. That's a bummer.
That's so sad. It's okay.
What other emoji should we add to the emoji button?
Good question.
Might be a dangerous question.
Dancing emoji.
Yeah, right. Yeah, we should definitely add the dancing girl, the dancing woman. Okay, I'm going to reveal. Great job. Globalization, right? So these organizations are really bringing the world together underneath different agreements, making it easier for countries to work together beyond borders. All right. Oh, there we go. The existence of the same popular fast food chain across many countries can be best explained by. Good question. We're gonna add a little kitty to the emojis. All right, reveal. Woo, spicy one.
I think this, I'm trying to see what answers people had put instead. I think this is a good one that really tests your skills on those keywords when you're doing multiple choice questions or any questions in general. So when we read the question, we're going to see that the word best is in there. So I think some of these answers could be argued that they are technically correct, that they can have like this impact for the existence of the same popular fast food chain across many countries. But when the AP exam asks for things in multiple choice, sometimes they like to throw in this, like, what best describes, what best does this. So you're going to have to think about it. And I think for this answer, this is going to be best described by globalization, because while it could be described by contagious diffusion or transnational migration, because those are both, I think, technically correct at its core, we're going to look at what's going to be it best explained by. So while it can be these two different things, contagious diffusion and transnational migration, both fall into the category of globalization. So we can see that overarching term is going to be globalization, which is why that's going to be the best answer for this multiple choice question, or that's how I particularly would view it.
Perfect. Same. It's just this is where they trip you up best. All right, last one. Which of the following are one of the Sustainable Development Goals? Easy. Let's get 100%. Oh my God. Can we not spam the chat like that, please? That'd be great. It's like a palate cleanser. Yeah, we'll delete it. All right, reveal. 98%. Good job. All of the above. It had 17 goals, so it has a lot of stuff in there. Great work, everybody. Unit 7 is tough. Y'all did a really awesome job getting the gist of it. Okay, so, I don't know why I stopped sharing my screen.
Okay, I don't know where Amanda went. Hopefully she will rejoin soon and share her screen, but we're going into a break. So we're going to go into
I literally just quit. I don't know what I did. I was like, okay, and we're done. Bye. All right, let's take a break, and then we will come on back for FRQ practice. So you can go ahead and take your break, and I will put this on the screen.
See you again.
Woo! Whoa. I'm just vibing. All right. All right, let me go. We'll get Steven. Bye.
AP Human Geo, we are here. Jessica, Avery, what is going on? We're bringing home Human Geo for the last hour. I love it. I love it. What is up? All right. I'm going to pop to the wing. Let me get my screen shared here. Would help if I had the slides open. All right. Is this already night 3?
4. It's 4.
4. Oh my Lord. That's crazy. Night 4. Chat, how are we feeling about the exam?
Do we want to put up a poll? I can do that real quick.
What do we think?
Yeah. On a scale from 1 to 5, how are we feeling?
I think good. I think they're feeling good. So scared. Better than before. Better than before. We love to hear that. About a 4.
All right. I set out a poll if you guys want to vote on that.
Yeah.
Looks pretty even. Nice bell curve right now.
Yeah.
3s and 4s mostly. That's honestly, for those of you voting 4s, I'm proud.
All right. Good presenter view. Boom. And captions. Toggle captions. Allow. I want to see if captions will pick up what you guys are saying. So, Avery, why don't you go ahead and introduce us to what we're doing here?
So right now we're about to go over some AP style questions rather than like what you saw in the quiz, which would be, so like our questions on the 5 level quizzes are more like just testing your knowledge over what we just taught you, whereas this is going to be the real deal. This is going to be the AP questions on that you might see on the test. Then keep in mind that the ones we're about to show you are going to be a little bit harder than what we've just been doing, and you're also going to see some stimulus-based questions, which basically means like you're going to be seeing a map or a model or a picture or maybe like a data table or something that you might need to look at or analyze or apply. Some of the concepts are going to require you to use knowledge that you've learned in multiple units and synthesize them and put them together. But we're here to help you and walk you through it and explain everything, and just let us know if you have any questions. This is going to be some really good practice for you guys.
All right, let me. Oh, we got to go through all of them here. I probably could have done this a little bit better. I'm going to be honest. The captions really, when they didn't show up, it was a moment for me. I had a moment. All right, let's go to MCQ practice. Let's do this thing. All right, so we're gonna do some AP style multiple choice questions, right? That's the plan. So one of the things I'll say here is I know we had a lot of people that were hungry for that multiple choice practice yesterday. I saw it in the chat. People were like, we want that AP style multiple choice quick practice. And I think it's really important to practice with AP style multiple choice practice. What we're going to see though is that with this exam, the FRQs and the MCQs really, it's going to be some kind of content knowledge and content application. And so Avery and Jessica are going to kind of talk you through tips and tricks but a lot of it's going to come down to kind of that stuff that we were doing yesterday, right? That multiple choice questions that we were doing yesterday, looking at knowledge of vocab terms and big ideas. That is all really important when it comes to multiple choice questions. But let's go to the next slide.
I guess I'll take this first question with the demographic transition model. It basically says, which of the following is a characteristic of a country moving from stage 2 to stage 3 of the DMT? And as you can see by the stimulus, we just have the standard demographic transition model, and we have the birth rate, death rate, total population. So we'll go by this, I guess, answer by answer. If you guys want to put in chat what you guys might think it is. But basically, A says a shorter life expectancy moving from stage 2 to stage 3, increased birth rate moving from stage 2 to stage 3, high level of female education, declining death rate, or increasing dependence on farm labor. If you guys want to go ahead and vote on that. I think I see mostly D's, almost entirely D's, actually.
It's looking good so far.
It is. Okay, I think the chat's definitive answer is D. And Stephen, if you want to click the next button, it should show the correct answer. Yes, it is D. So basically, you can see, even if you didn't really know the DMT, you can see based on the graph, the death rate is definitely going down, is decreasing from stage 2 to stage 3. And you really don't have to have prior knowledge of the DMT for this, but this is a great example of a stimulus-based question, what that might look like.
I mean, hopefully you guys would know like the DMT like the back of your hand at this point, but in any other case, like if you're given a model, if you're given a table, like anything, definitely look at it to answer the question, because most times like they'll give you the answer to the question in what's provided there. So we'll go on to the second question. Which of the following which of the following factors best explains the development and expansion of squatter settlements? So this is something that we touched upon last night when we were talking about Unit 6 things. I'll read you the answer choices really quickly. A, gentrification of megacities in more developed countries displacing large numbers of urban dwellers. B, rapid urbanization and inability of infrastructure to keep pace with the growth of megacities. Oh. I cannot read anymore, but bear with us, guys. Sorry about that.
Okay, then we'll just move you.
All right.
Whatever.
C, urban dwellers seeking residential housing. Okay, you guys are already answering. I'll stop reading out the questions. You guys know your stuff. Yeah, so if you want to go to the next slide. Yeah, you guys got it. The correct answer is B. Hopefully you learned a lot last night from our Unit 6 coverage. But yeah, this is exactly what's happening, because this usually happens in at least like lesser developed countries or countries that are beginning to urbanize, where the rate of urbanization and people moving to cities it's way too fast for the rate at which the country can build infrastructure. And so what ends up happening is that the city and, the space in the city, the infrastructure isn't big enough to accommodate all the people. So you get the development of squatter settlements on the outskirts. A just talks about gentrification, and then C mostly talks about like suburbanization, which is very different than the development of squatter settlements.
I'm going to try to move us back on screen here. And we good. So these are two really good examples of the different types of multiple choice questions that you're going to get on the exam. And so one of the things, and I think a really good point was made when it comes to graphs and maps, charts, is that you're typically going to see a question based off of those stimulus materials that is actually going to answer the question for you. Really what they want you to do is, can you look at a graph? Can you look at a demographic transition model, and can you pull information from it? Can you look at it, and can you come to a conclusion based off of what it's telling you? And so it's really important that when you get these stimulus materials that you read them, you really read them. I think we were talking about this last night when we said it's really easy when you're like 20 multiple choice questions in and your brain starts to just like go into autopilot mode, right? And that happens to everybody. Our brain just goes into autopilot mode. And it's really important to center yourself, to recenter yourself, and to make sure that we're reading everything carefully. Okay. Even a question like question 6, right? Question 6 is asking you about squatter settlements, right? You don't have a stimulus material, you don't have anything to base this off of, you just have those vocabulary words. Well, if you just skim over and you see the word squatter settlement, you might pick the wrong answer because you didn't actually read the question, right? The question might mention squatter settlements, but might say something like, what doesn't lead to the rise of squatter settlements, right? Like the question is there for a reason. You need to read the entire thing. Okay. All right, do we want to keep rocking?
Yep.
Okay.
So for question 15, this one is a little longer, as you can tell, but it basically says the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea sets a limit on the exclusive economic zone at 200 nautical miles from a country's coastline. In cases where countries are less than 400 nautical miles apart at sea, which of the following best explains how the exclusive economic zone boundary is determined for each country? So we have A, both countries will state their case to the United Nations during a hearing of the Security Council, so like a case-by-case type of thing. B, both countries will follow the median line principle. C, both countries will share all water of the area. D, neither country can claim the area as an exclusive economic zone because the area is considered international water. Or E, both countries will receive increased territorial sea claims up to 24 nautical miles, but will have no exclusive economic zone. See a lot of B's in the chat.
Should we reveal the answer? I think we're pretty
I think we're pretty set on B right now. That's completely correct. This one you do sort of have to know about the EEZ rules and laws and stuff. However, I feel like you can sort of figure it out just based on what you think might be most appropriate. But also, since this includes median line principle, you can kind of assume that since you don't know what else this could be, the median line principle is a vocab word that pretty much states what it means. I don't know. So.
And for anyone who doesn't know, just like, okay, so I'm getting some questions on chat what it is. So basically the EEZ extends 200 miles from the coast, right? So let's say, and you have two countries, but there's not 400 miles in between. So neither country can have the full 200. So that's the problem in the question. And so that means the median line principle is what it sounds like. It's going to take the middle. It's going to take like the middle line between the distance between those two countries, and then each country gets half of that. So let's say that there's like 300 miles instead of 400 miles between each. The EEZ is going to extend 150 miles from the coastline of each, if that makes sense to you guys.
Yeah, and Avery made a good point where she said, you know, you have to kind of know a little bit of background information here, right, to answer this question, right? This is very much a content-based question. But if you don't know the content, you can kind of still figure it out, right? You can kind of use your best guess judgment. And, you know, this is something that I think is good for all AP students to know when they take multiple choice AP tests, is that you aren't going to get penalized for guessing. You don't get penalized for giving a wrong answer. If you give a wrong answer, you just don't get the point. You don't lose a point for a wrong answer. You just don't receive a point for the wrong answer. So you should never leave a multiple choice question blank. Ever, 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 never, ever do it. Okay? Always fill in the bubbles. Every time. But what you should do is if you get a question like this, right? Question 15 on your exam, you're reading this, the United Nations Convention of the Laws of the Seas, and you're like, oh no, I don't know this at all. Skip it, make a little note to yourself that you're going to return back to question 15, finish your multiple choice. Come back to question 15 at the end and reread it, and something might have triggered in your brain. If it didn't, that's when you start using those skills that you've developed all year to read and understand a question. All right. And then you do your best guess to try to figure it out. Okay. Again, you want to maximize the kind of knowledge that you have to the fullest extent. Okay. All right, let's go to question 13.
Yeah. So question 13, you're gonna have to like read the table that they show. Compare the largest municipality populations for each country and then select the following statement that correctly draws a conclusion regarding the pattern in the data. I can't read you all the question choices because the question is like blocking it, but yeah. I'm seeing some C's, some B's, some D's, some E's, some mixed responses, but we're gonna go over it. All right, so the correct answer is C, neither country follows the rank size rule. And to answer this kind of requires you to have, one, a grasp of like the concepts and knowing what the vocab words mean, but also being able to apply them. So we know that the rank size rule in simple terms means that, so take the largest city in a country. The second largest city is going to be have half the population of the largest city, and then it's like so on and so forth. A primate city, which is mentioned, let me see, in like answer choices like A and E, it's just a city that's disproportionately larger than the other cities like in that country. And so C is correct because if we look at the table, neither of them follow the rank size rule because like let's take the United States, for example, first. New York is 18.8 million, and half of that would be what, like 9.4 million, but Los Angeles is too big for that. So it's not that New York is disproportionately larger, it's that LA is too big to follow the rank size rule. And essentially the same thing applies for China. And that's why the correct answer is C, because it's not that both countries have primate cities, it's that the second largest and then consequently the smaller cities following the largest city are too big to actually follow the rank size rule. Yeah, and I'm seeing like some dispute in the chat. Even if like largely the US does follow rank size rule, you have to specifically use what's given to you like in the table. So in that way, like don't try to outsmart the question or overthink it. Really use the stimulus given to you because that's what the answer is based off of. Okay, I think we're good.
So for question number 12, which of the following best explains a neo-Malthusian perspective on the Green Revolution? A, the Green Revolution represents a jump in agricultural technology, but population will still grow faster than our ability to produce food will over the long run. B, the Green Revolution solves the entire problem of feeding the planet, and Malthusian ideas are no longer relevant. C, local food production is key to long-term food production. D, the distribution of food in a capitalist system results in too many people being unable to afford basic foods. And then E, the increase in the food supply and a resulting increase in the population available for farm labor will solve the food crisis. I'm seeing a lot of A's. I think 1B or 1D. Mostly A's though. Someone says E or B. Mostly A's. If we want to go ahead and reveal that. The answer is, in fact, A. I'm glad that a lot of you got that right. So basically, if we're taking a neo-Malthusian perspective on it, we're going to want to agree with what Malthus said. And that was that eventually food production, though it is going to get higher, the population will grow exponentially higher. And eventually, we will reach a point where we can't feed everyone. And then this is mostly disproved by the Green Revolution, which exponentially improves food production as well. So it's more so keeping up with it. But if we're taking a neo-Malthusian perspective, we're going to agree with what Malthus says. And we're going to say, sure, this is happening, but it's still going to outgrow us in the long run.
Yeah, and one of the things that I want to just add to this is if you're unsure, like if you're stuck between two answers, for example, on a multiple choice question, one of the things to keep in mind is that very rarely is a question going to be, or very rarely is an answer going to be absolute. And you see here, some of these answers are absolute answers, right? So let's look at like E, for example, right? Letter E here on question 12. The increase in the food supply and a resulting increase in the population available for farm labor will solve the food crisis. That is a definite, absolute statement. There is no doubting that this statement is saying that the increase in food supply will solve the food crisis. Very rarely are these statements going to be correct. Very rarely are you going to see a multiple choice question where the correct answer is an absolute, definite response. Not saying that it will always happen, right? There are exceptions to this rule, but if you're stuck between two answers and you're like, I have no idea, if one of them is super definite, like E is, I would go with the other one, because that's just more likely to be correct. Okay. All right, let's go to question 10.
Yeah, just on that, that's a super great point. And if you see wording like always or never in questions, that might be a sign that those aren't the correct answer, because as you know, studying, the AP Human Geo models, the world doesn't work in absolutes. It doesn't work in a perfect way. And wording like that is really not the best way to answer questions usually. So number 10, which the following is a pull factor affecting migration to some of the more developed countries? I've seen a lot of answers in the chat, so I'll just give you a little bit of time, but a lot of answers coming in so far. Okay, we can probably move on to the answer. Yes, so the correct answer, as many of you guys said in the chat, is D, universal healthcare. You can answer this just knowing your vocab, what a pull factor is. It's something that makes a country attractive, why you want to go there. The rest of these are actually push factors of things you don't like and why you would want to leave. And you can think back to earlier when we were looking at development, and you remember the map that showed, the level of healthcare and cost in different countries, and how the US was like the only developed one that didn't have like free healthcare. You can think generally most developed countries do have universal healthcare. So thinking about the wording of the question and matching it to the answers.
So now we're on to FRQ practice, which is of course half of the exam. So we have the MCQ, which is going to be half the exam, an hour long, and now the FRQs, which is also half the exam and an hour and 15 minutes, I believe. So get on with it. First, I think that it's really important that we go over the FRQ task verbs, mostly because whenever I was in AP Human Geography myself, my teacher said to me, the main thing that students get wrong is not correctly answering the question. So the four main verbs that appear in AP Human Geography FRQs are identify, describe, explain, and discuss. Identify means just one complete sentence. It's the easiest one in my opinion, I think in everyone's opinion. You're just going to go for it. You're going to give a description, or you're going to tell the answer, basically. Describe would be 1 to 2 sentences with a little extra information. So you're gonna identify it, but then you're gonna elaborate a little bit more. Explain, you're gonna want to do an AEC paragraph, so an answer, explain / example, and connect. For me, this was always assertion, evidence, commentary, but pretty much the same thing. And then discuss, you're going to write about multiple perspectives, similarities, differences, basically give a well-rounded view on this matter.
Yep, and I think we can dive into our FRQ right now.
Yeah, and I really want to hit on this again, right? These words are really important, and they're going to follow you around to other AP classes. So if you want to take AP World, AP US History, whatever, these words follow you around.
All right, so this is the first FRQ that we're going to do of 3, and it's broken down into many different parts. So there's no question on the screen right now, but just look at the pictures for a second. We're going to be talking about agriculture. And as the caption says, the picture shows 2 types of agriculture in the world. So we can get into part A. So part A asks to identify the grain crop shown in each photo. So think about the task verb that you have right here, identify. You only need to be writing 1 sentence. If you want to split each crop into 2, or each photo into 2 sentences, 2 sentences max. And another thing that one of my teachers told me a while ago was AP stands for answer the prompt. answer the prompt. That's a really important thing to be doing. You can't get credit for writing, a beautiful response if it doesn't actually answer the question at hand. And so you really want to make sure you're being responsive to the question asked. We'll get into that more later.
So firstly, you're going to want to identify the grain crop shown in each photo. You guys can answer that in the chat if you want. But remember, identify, you're just going to want 1 or 2 sentences max, and you're just going to say, this is X and Y. You know what I mean? So that would be it. And let me see some of your responses. Rice and wheat.
Yeah. What we're seeing so far in the chat generally is looking great. Saying photo Y is rice, and then photo Z is a type of grain crop like wheat. Yeah. I think we're good to go on to part B. Okay. So part B asks you to discuss 2 economic differences between subsistence agriculture and commercial agriculture. And again, look at the task verb that you're being assigned. You want to discuss 2 economic differences, and then also economic. If you're talking about like cultural or political differences, you're unfortunately not going to get the point for that. You want to be responsive to the question that they're specifically asking you. So we'll give you some time to answer that. You can put your answers in the chat, and then we'll go over them and show you the scoring guideline after we get through the entire question. Yeah, so what I'm seeing so far is looking pretty good. You guys tend to be talking about the difference between what subsistence means, that you're just growing enough food for your family. It's not really having a commercial purpose. You're not really trying to make money off of it. You're just trying to feed your family, versus commercial being something that's more like, one, you need more capital to do it, but also that you're trying to make money off of it as well. I'm seeing that the discussion of that is good and the differences there. Okay, are we ready for part C? Okay, so part C asks you to identify 1 environmental impact resulting from the type of agriculture shown in photo Y. So just again, identify just 1 sentence, 1 and done, and think back to yesterday when we were thinking about the environmental effects of different types of agriculture.
So I'm seeing a lot of different answers for this one, whether it be like soil salinization or water runoff and things like that. And we're about to go over the score guideline after, I think, part D. And you'll be able to see by that a lot of these answers are correct, and there are multiple different answers that we could say for this. And so I think most people are correct about this.
And part D just asks you, same thing, just apply it to photo Z now. Yeah, so part D, I see a lot of discussion of things like pollution, use of fertilizers, things like that, which definitely can, contribute to, water quality concerns that we're going to talk about right now.
So this is the example of the scoring guideline I was talking about. As you can see, so for part A, most of you guys said rice and wheat, and those were correct. For photo Y, you could only say rice because, as you can see, the wet fields means that it's going to be rice, and there's not really any other. I mean, you could grow cranberries in a wet field, but it's going to look really different. For photo Z, actually, since you couldn't really see the crops, and it was more so just like, I guess, a textbook example of extensive agriculture, you could have said wheat, oats, barley, rye, flax, millet, triticale. Can't say I know that one. Canola, and then also you could say rice, but dry rice. I know most of you said wheat.
And for part B, there are many things that you could have said comparing subsistence and commercial. I think most of you focused on definitely economic purpose, saying that subsistence is more family-based, commercial is you want to make a profit, you're selling beyond the family. I also got a lot of responses about size or scale, subsistence being smaller, commercial being larger. You could have also talked about just generally internationally, subsistence tends to be more in LDCs, commercial more in MDCs, and the capital needed to do that, lower levels of capital for subsistence, higher for commercial, as well as other inputs like chemicals, fertilizers, and generally like high amounts of human input for subsistence, lower levels of technology, and conversely commercial having higher levels of technology, lower levels of like brute physical human labor, but you still need, humans to run the tech and stuff. Finally, you could have talked about gender, how a lot of subsistence farming is done by women, whereas commercial farming is mostly done by men. Although women are still involved, they take up a smaller proportion of those farmers.
So for part C, you could have identified habitat loss, water quality, increased wetlands, changes to natural systems by landscape modification, disease, soil quality, and air quality. I noticed a lot of you saying soil quality, which so that would be like soil salinization. That's pretty much it. That's all I have to say about that one. Is that identify, and you could said these.
Yeah, and I think like loss of biodiversity and habitat loss are kind of an easy like go-to for these. I don't know, most of you are freshmen, but if you've ever taken APES, definitely you can apply that knowledge here. Yeah.
Yeah, it can be, it can be quite difficult to, I guess, answer the rest of these questions if you don't know what type of, so if you couldn't get part A right, it could be difficult to do part B, C, and D. So I like what you said about like habitat loss and decrease in biodiversity being like a go-to answer for these. So if you really don't know and you can't think of a better example or a more specific example, I would say, yeah, go for habitat loss, biodiversity.
Yeah. And also like pollution, just like decreasing air quality, water quality, soil quality are typically going to happen with any type of agriculture that you're doing, unless it's like, very localized and organic typically. And so as you see, like those answers, air quality, water quality, and soil quality would have been okay for both C and D. So if you wanted to shove those in your brain right now of like, how does agriculture hurt the environment? Those 3 things are good to hit. And so for D, you also could have talked about air quality, just like pesticides, vehicle exhaust, and then also dust, being bad and being pollutants in the air. Same thing with water quality, that you would also mention like pollution, at least in the water, causing runoff, causing dead zones, maybe if you knew about eutrophication, but that's a whole apes topic. Same thing with soil quality. You also touched on a lot: erosion, nutrient loss, salinization, like things like that. Modified biodiversity can also be something that you talk about, and like decreased crop variety, because we're growing one crop, we're just doing monoculture, and that can decrease the number of other, the variety of living organisms in the area. And then also water availability, because it takes a lot of water to run commercial agriculture. So you're depleting the water sources like groundwater and aquifers in order to do that. Yeah.
And then one thing I wanted to point out about photo Z, even if you could go back to, I guess, the stimulus material. As you can see, you can legitimately, like, you can see the gas coming up from these machines. So that's like a really easy like pull for an environmental effects, that you can quite literally see the air pollution coming out. I just want to point that out.
Yeah. And then I think someone just asked me to reiterate like the 3 things. If you're asked about negative environmental impacts, air, soil, and water decrease in quality, or air, soil, and water pollution are an easy 3 to talk about, because everything's bad for the environment when you grow food. Okay, I think unless you have any pressing questions on this FRQ, I think we're good to move on to the next one.
Awesome. It seems people are pretty good. One point I want to make with FRQs really quick is you got to write to the point. Be super concise and to the point. What you guys have to understand about AP readers is you have a person who is reading probably like one single part of this FRQ over and over and over and over and over again, like literally thousands of these FRQs. And what they want to see is that you answer the question as clearly and concisely as possible. So do not add fluff. Don't add like all this extra stuff. They don't need to know about like, what you ate for dinner that night. They don't need to know about any of these things. Just get to the point, answer the question, and then move on. Okay. Be clear and be concise, right? Make sure you're actually answering the question. Make sure you're paying attention to those keywords. But with FRQs, you really want to make sure you're just get to the point and then move on, which a lot of y'all did. I saw in your responses. I just want to say a lot of those responses were exactly that. You said one environmental impact of, blah, 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 and went from there. And that's perfect. All right, let's move on.
So this is a stimulus-based FRQ again. You'll have one non-stimulus based, one with one stimulus, and then one with 2. This is, I guess, the second question, so it has one stimulus. And it says, the older neighborhood shown in the picture is undergoing changes in its demographic profile as the existing built landscape is renovated. So we have this building with all these cranes and stuff around it, and it says, resist gentrification, move back to the suburbs. So part A is asking, explain 2 ways that gentrification may positively impact neighborhoods. If you guys want to go ahead and try to answer that.
And just a note on the word explain, it's okay if you're like abbreviating in the chat right now and you just like, like listing 2 ways that gentrification could positively impact neighborhoods. But when you're actually doing the real deal, you want to take your concisely, but take your time, write it out, explain your analysis and your reasoning and thought process of how you're getting to the conclusion and why these things are actually a positive impact. You want to do more than just list things on the actual exam. I'm sure you guys know that, but yeah. So I'm seeing a lot of good answers so far. A lot of you guys are hitting on what is actually correct, saying that gentrification can raise property values. It can, improve the aesthetics of an area, improve the infrastructure of the area, and, raising property value also increases like taxability, all that good stuff. Yeah, so I think we're ready to move on to part B. Okay, explain 2 ways that gentrification may negatively impact neighborhoods. So same thing, just the opposite this time.
I see a lot of great answers that really, I guess, revolve around what I think is like the main most notable negative effect of gentrification, which would be, of course, raising the housing value so high that the original people who lived there could not continue to live there anymore. So I see a lot of that, and I like it.
All right, so the last part before we show you the answer key is C, identify and explain 1 way that city governments may reduce the negative impacts of gentrification. So just what can local governments do about this? Yeah. And this is a little side note, but I saw a really good answer earlier. I think Carolyn said that gentrification can cause a sense of placelessness. I thought that was really interesting, which is really true. That was a good answer to the question, I think. So I'm seeing a lot of great answers so far that are correctly answering the question. I see you guys talking about reduced taxes, subsidies, using zoning to create areas for more affordable housing, which are all fully acceptable answers for this prompt. And so now we'll unveil all of the answer key and we'll talk through it. Okay, so for part A, 2 ways that gentrification can positively impact neighborhoods. You guys knocked this one out of the park. You hit the first one on here a lot, like increasing property value. because you're coming in, buying things at a low price, taking the property, renovating it, and selling it at a high price. So you're making money, and it's nice now. It's really aesthetic. So you're increasing the value of the property. That can also have an impact on the tax base as well, which not as many people talked about, but I saw a few. A lot of you also talked about how making an area nicer, more aesthetic will attract new businesses and more people to live there, and that will increase, traffic and tourism, all of that good stuff. I don't think as many people talked about new employment, especially in construction and the renovation part of it, but that's another fully acceptable answer that you could have talked about. And some people talked about how, aestheticism, changing the cultural landscape, improves it aesthetically. I did see a few answers about that, as well as increase like amenities and infrastructure and, roads and stuff like that.
So for part B, which was explain 2 ways gentrification may negatively impact neighborhoods, I think I saw mostly stuff about B1, which is displacement due to rising property values and rents. And then I think I also saw a few things about I guess sense of placelessness will also relate to changing businesses as a small locally owned business with nationally owned things. So you're gonna lose that I guess specificness to your area, so the place.
And then for part C, there were pretty much like 3 ways that you could have answered affordable housing programs, which would include like subsidies, tax credits, or just like lowering taxes for people of lower socioeconomic status, or like also establishing low cost or charitable group home renovation programs. Not as many people talked about that, mostly the first 2 for affordable housing. There's also historical preservation laws. I don't think as many people touched upon this, but this essentially talks about how like nonprofit organizations could come in and help manage and preserve like the buildings and the property of low-income residents. And I think a lot of people talked about the third one, which was urban planning or zoning, how the government can implement policies to create spaces within a city specifically for people of lower socioeconomic backgrounds. And fun fact, a little tangent, there was like a court case where I'm from a few years ago, basically saying that for every unit of new housing you build, you also have to add on so many like units of affordable housing. So that's an answer that you could steal and a policy solution that you could use because it's actually being used in real life. Yeah. And I think in our last 15 minutes or so, we'll move on to the last FRQ if we don't have any pressing questions. I did see one question like, is gentrification good or bad? I think it really depends, as you saw in the last question, its use and the level of involvement the local government has. It can be used for good and bad. And it's important to know both sides of it.
So this last FRQ is mostly Unit 4, which is kind of my territory, but it basically says political geographers classify most countries as either unitary or federal states. And then part A, we have 2 pictures. This is an example of the 2 stimulus ones. Part A says define unitary state and identify the country shown that fits the definition of a unitary state. So we have Germany and Japan. Which one of those is a unitary state pretty much? So you're going to want to say a unitary state is X and the country shown that depicts this is Y. And then if you don't remember what a unitary, or if you don't remember which one might be an example of unitary state, I can go over that once we're sort of closer to the end or in the score guide. Okay, so I see a lot of good straight to the point answers. unitary state is a central government, and that would be Japan. So I guess we can go on to part B now. Explain one positive and one negative impact of a unitary system.
And just in case like you forgot or you didn't know which one was a unitary state, you can kind of just look at the maps here. See how Japan is just it's just one. There are no internal borders, nothing. But with Germany, you have it like broken down into the state itself into different little parts internally. So that's kind of an indicator that there's at least another level of governance going on. Yeah. In case you forgot.
That's exactly what I was going to say. As we were saying earlier, make sure that you really use the stimuluses. Look at the graphs, look at the maps, and get any, I guess, hints that you can get from those.
Yeah, but y'all crushed the first question anyway, so good job. Yeah, so for part B, I'm seeing a lot of great answers that have to do with the benefit being the efficiency or the swiftness with which the government can act, because there's just one level of governance that affects the entire country, which is it's a great answer. And for the negative, I'm seeing a lot of talking about feeling like disconnected or lack of representation or just feeling not super well represented by just one level of government, by the central government, which is also a great answer to the question, although there could have been other ones that we'll talk about in a second. But first, part C, identify and explain one reason why some countries are governed as federal states. All right, I'm seeing a lot of great answers, but I think it's time to look at the answer key and then we can get into it.
So part A says define unitary state and identify the country shown that fits the definition of unitary state. This is pretty straightforward. You're just going to say that a unitary state is organized in such a way that most power is placed in a central government. So as long as I think you have that central government part, you should get the point for that. And then you have to say Japan specifically for that second point.
Yep. And then for part B, the one positive impact, one negative impact of this unitary system, a lot of you guys talked about the positive impact. Where was it? Number 3, efficiency achieved like through just one layer of government as opposed to 2. You could have talked about other things like efficiency meaning standardization of laws, or things like less potential for corruption because there's only one layer of government, or a greater sense of patriotism or more cultural unity. within a country, but talking about efficiency is perfectly fine. A lot of you nailed that one. So good job on that. And for the negative impact, a lot of you talked about mostly number 1 and number 2. Centralization of power can lead to people feeling, at least in like at the local level, really disconnected from their central government, which can lead to, you know, political strife and whatnot. And this is really related to number 2, that marginalization of a local culture through standardization at a country level. So I think that like a good example of why unitary systems might not work everywhere is like in Canada, for example. The Quebecois, like in Quebec, have a stronghold, at least at the local level. But if there were to be no local governments, the Quebecois would feel like really alienated and disconnected from the larger like Anglophone government. So it's important in that way, like unitary systems do have negative impacts, and that's why luckily Canada isn't a unitary system. For negative impacts, you also could have talked about how decisions and policies could easily be dominated by one interest group because there's only one layer of government, again, or how it could either like the central government could be bogged down by competing local problems, which wouldn't have a local level to be solved within, or it could lead to a slow response time for local issues because the government is less involved on the local level as well. So there were many answers that you could have given for part B.
Part C says, identify and explain one reason why some countries are governed as federal states. And so basically you're going to want to identify that first, of course, as multiple nationalities, ethnicities, and or cultures to cater to address devolutionary forces arising from physical, economic, or political differences, or larger countries that have to, I guess, spread their control over very large areas. I saw a lot of you answering with, I guess, the first two being, I guess, the connect of power between like local levels. And to tie this back to, I guess, some more Unit 4 topics, if you look back to, I guess it was Germany and Japan, you can think of the nation state and then the multinational state. So that would be Japan and Germany, respectively. And you can even tie this to these things that you're supposed to identify, these different cultures that you have to cater to. So Japan, it doesn't have all these cultures. It's going to be a unitary state. They can afford to have just one central government. Whereas Germany, they have many different regions. They have so many different types of people that they're going to want to go federal.
Yeah, and I think it's good, at least for unitary, federal, confederate, to have like an example of each in your mind of, you know, like a case study almost. So like unitary could be Japan. France, when I was taking this course, I thought of France as like my go-to unitary state. It's kind of changing a little bit, but America would be a great example of a federal state. Same with Canada. Like imagine if we didn't have 2 layers of government in America, we're so ideologically divided, like we would go crazy. It would not be great. So understand, like you need that state level because people feel closer to that states, and that actually connects to, where was it? Both one, like multiple cultures and like needing representation, because even if that's like ideologically, like culture in America is very different. So we need different levels to feel heard. And then for Confederate, there are some modern countries that have like Confederate governments, but I think of the Articles of Confederation in America that it was just a bunch of different states, and that's all it is. There's no big top-down government. It's just everything is happening on the local level. Yeah. So in the last 3 minutes, I guess we could take any remaining questions if you want. Yeah.
Yeah, but first things first, like tying back to what Jessica said about having examples, having an example in your mind for each one of these terms and topics, I guess, will really help you to make these connections and find the answers that you're supposed to find. Any questions now?
Yeah, really quick, if you guys have questions, the green button at the bottom of your screen, it says AP Hug Night 4 survey. Go ahead and click that, fill out the quick survey about this session tonight. And as Amanda said, there will be gifts given to some random survey participants. I see a question.
Yeah,
Can you
please.
explain the difference between hierarchical, oh my lord, stimulus and contagious diffusion?
So stimulus diffusion, a main characteristic of this is that it's similar to contagious in that it's going from one place to another, I guess just from inspiration. But stimulus, they're going to take this piece of culture, but then they're going to change it and sort of adapt it to their own styles. Hierarchical, I feel, is very different from the other two in that it's obviously marketed by the hierarchy and how this is going to go from the top to the bottom, if that sort of explains your question.
And then contagion just needs like it spreads to everyone, you know, regardless of class and pretty much without change. And it usually needs like face-to-face contact. So an example of hierarchical would be like fashion trends goes from the elite to the common people. Stimulus, a good example I feel like would be McDonald's in places that are more vegetarian. You're taking the same idea but adapting it to local culture because, you know, those places there don't eat meat, so they need substitutes. And then contagious diffusion could be things like religion or even disease. Like disease is a really common one.
Yeah, so more on stimulus. So think of like most of us live in America, so that would be like having the Italian pizza, but then we're taking it over to America and we're adapting it to American palates by making it cheesier, saucier, everything, or mostly. So that's a more personal example for a lot of us.
All right, I think it's about that time. I think
It
it's
is
time
too.
to shut it down. 10 o'clock, 3 hours. Awesome. Well, thanks y'all for coming. It's been a blast. I know I was only here for like an hour, but I had a great time. Tomorrow, that's it. This is it. Tomorrow is the last night we have together.
Yeah, and before you go, guys, please remember to take that survey. It really helps us to improve our crams, and it really serves you guys.
Yeah. But thank you guys for joining us tonight. We hope to see you all tomorrow. Don't forget to do that survey. And we'll see you tomorrow.
Hey, guys.
Bye, everybody.